Everyone can agree that Callisto Protocol wasn't perfect. There's a lot of crawling through vents, squeezing through pipes, it had some frustrating enemies that did lack variety, and there was a divisive combat system. However, after revisiting Callisto Protocol about a year removed from the hype, it's clear that this game deserved better than its open critic score of 67. Striking Distance deserved better than the fate that it saw with an extremely solid foundation. I think Callisto Protocol deserved a sequel, which at this point will likely not happen, at least not for a long while. Glen Schofield, the creator of Dead Space, starts his own studio, and his dream project is another sci-fi horror game without the limitations that many thought EA had imposed on the game. This sounds like a recipe for success, so what happened? Let's take a look at what went wrong, what went right, and what could have been different. No place makes more sense to talk about what went wrong with the Callisto Protocol than the sales figures. Unless a game is a runaway success, most studios just don't divulge specific sales data, but most estimates do have the Callisto Protocol somewhere north of 2 million copies. Unfortunately, Krafton, parent company of Striking Distance, had pretty high expectations of over 5 million copies, which seems quite high for a brand new IP from a brand new studio that was almost exclusively developed during the pandemic. Over 2 million copies is a great start. Capcom, who have been in the industry for decades, have said that sales of over 1 million units is the generally accepted standard for a major hit. As a result of missing these sales expectations, Striking Distance had to lay off about 20% of their staff, which works out to about 30 people. The other repercussion was that founder Glen Schofield stepped away from the company as the CEO, along with their CFO and their COO. These were all supposedly voluntary departures, but it's hard not to see the parallels between these three leaving and the sales. Another major issue is the release window. December is a very tricky time of the year to try to release a game. You end up getting buried under Game of the Year lists and end of the year content from many sites and outlets, in addition to people being very busy as the holidays approach. The other major issue with the launch window was that it was only about a month between the Callisto Protocol and the Dead Space remake, which had already been established as a winning formula with a reputation that had only grown over time. To be honest, looking at the sales of both of these games, it seemed like a situation that ended up hurting both, as there is only so much survival horror that many can handle. As for the game itself, it is understandable that some people could have an issue with the combat becoming repetitive, but it also feels like something that is slightly exaggerated. There are enough different enemy types that act and react differently, including the riot guard with the helmet that needs to be accounted for, or the tentacle enemies that need to be focused on immediately. In addition to enemy variety, there is also the leveling system for your weapons, which allows you to adjust the combat to your preference. The stun baton and the grip can be upgraded if you want a more melee-based system, or there were numerous weapons that you could upgrade if you're looking for a more ranged experience. At the start of the game, I was mostly melee, and by the end, with my upgraded grip, I was throwing almost everyone onto spikes and off of ledges. Now, it might not be a masterclass in combat design, but it was far from the worst. The lighting is creepy, the audio is tense, but the game doesn't fully embrace the stealth elements as much as it should have. There is no way to sneak past certain areas without having to fight a lot of enemies. What went right? There is a lot to like and enjoy about the Callisto Protocol. Immediately, the visuals are stunning and the game features a cinematic quality, with the intro demanding your attention before the title sequence pops up about 10 minutes into a game. Now, maybe I'm a sucker for a good delayed title card sequence, but when done right, it elevates the game. The story was solid with a dystopian sci-fi future, the voice acting was incredible, which was to be expected with the cast that did include Josh Duhamel and Sam Witwer, and as is required for any horror title, the audio and lighting were excellent. The Callisto Protocol didn't overstay its welcome, and you have an absurdly high amount of death animations, two pretty good traits for a survival horror game. Then there was also the great podcast that tied into the release of the game called Helix Station, with a 6-episode run that ended the week before the release of the game. It featured Gwendolyn Christie from Game of Thrones fame and had a high production value that felt reminiscent of the Halo podcast Hunt the Truth that led up to the release of Halo 5 Guardians. The most obvious answer to what could have been different would have been just to delay the game by about 6 months, and that would have largely removed it from the direct comparison conversation between it and the Dead Space remake. People also wouldn't have been forced to decide between purchasing one over the other, and sadly, since Krafton is a publicly traded company, there were shareholders to please, and delaying the game would have negatively affected the stock price. This probably wasn't an option. Delaying the game, though, would have given the devs time to work on optimization, the enemy AI, and possibly even adding a few different enemy types to add in some variety. With a little more leeway, the Callisto Protocol could have had the chance to become a solid franchise, or at the very least produced an even better sequel. Some of the greatest games of all time are sequels that improved on the original. Super Metroid, Silent Hill 2, Titanfall 2, Killzone 2, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat 2, Resident Evil 2, Uncharted 2, and Assassin's Creed 2 are just a few of the titles that come to mind immediately. Even when looking at Dead Space, the obvious influence here, many consider Dead Space 2 to be the best of the series. The reported budget for the Callisto Protocol was around $162 million, and one way that would have made sense to offset the cost would have been to make a deal for Xbox Game Pass. With the recent Microsoft leaks, we have a better idea of what Xbox would pay for premium games on the service at launch. Phil Spencer has estimated that it would have taken about $300 million to get Star Wars Jedi Survivor, about $250 million for Mortal Kombat 1, and about $100 million for Assassin's Creed Mirage. Now, based off the hype that Callisto Protocol had going into release, I would say that between $100 and $150 million would have been the cost to get the Callisto Protocol on Xbox Game Pass at launch. Obviously, hindsight is 20/20, but it seems like Xbox Game Pass would have been a very smart move for striking distance, as it would have helped cover the majority of development costs. People also do seem to be a little bit more accepting of flaws when the game is on Xbox Game Pass. Unfortunately, the Callisto Protocol had some type of deal with PlayStation, so we will never know. At one point, since Striking Distance is owned by Krafton, who also owns the PUBG IP, the Callisto Protocol was going to take place in the same universe. There was some confusion to this, and eventually, in the 11th hour, was removed. Now, contrary to popular opinion, I think this would have been a good idea. PUBG was one of the biggest games on the planet just a few short years ago. It has sold over 75 million copies, and it did single-handedly put the Battle Royale genre on the map. From a story perspective, it was kind of weird that 100 people are just fighting to the death on some random island, and maybe this could have been a simulation or another Earth-like planet, and setting the Callisto Protocol in the PUBG universe probably could have added a little familiarity to an unknown IP, and could have also been cross-promoted with the PUBG audience, maybe with some skins in the game like a Black Iron Prison jumpsuit. PUBG is even still quite popular today, as in September 2023 there were over 400,000 concurrent players. Based on some of the heinous things that you learned by the end of the Callisto Protocol, having some people pulling the strings on a Squid Game type situation would have aligned perfectly. It almost seems as though Callisto Protocol was doomed to fail from the start, or at least the odds were highly stacked against it. Being compared to one of the best survival horror games of all time, being owned by a publicly traded company, unrealistic sales expectations, release proximity to the Dead Space remake, a new studio, and the majority of development happening during the pandemic are all part of the uphill battle that Callisto Protocol had to face. It also appears that we now live in a world where a 7 out of 10 for a premium release is basically the same as a massive flop. Before the release of the Callisto Protocol, I said that if I had to pick between a brand new IP and a remake of a classic, I would choose the new IP every day. I still stand by that choice, and it's unfortunate that we will likely never see how amazing a sequel could have been with a little more development time and a little more freedom.